I don't know where to start this. It's hard to really put it into words just how shocking this event has come off to me. I guess the best place to start would be to explain what happened. When I was around 10, I had a loving dog named Jocko. He was a husky, and we would go for walks almost every day. One day, however, his rope snapped. He must have seen a squirrel or another small animal and ran off into the woods to chase it. I remember running home in hysterics and explaining what had happened to Dad. He yelled at me, but eventually he went out to his truck and went to go find him. He was gone for about 5 hours, and when he came back, I could tell from his red face and his angered expression that he hadn't found Jocko. Even though I could tell he wasn't coming home, I attempted to ask him if he found my loving dog. "Dad, did you find Jack?" I was immediately slapped in the face and sent off to my room to bed. I was crying into my pillow all night. Jocko was an amazing dog. I'd never loved something more until the night he ran off. I remember his bright red collar with a brass pendant labeled J.O. It had a little dog paw print above his initials. Fast forward to now, I'm 55 years old and I've been working as a dentist for the last 21 years. I was going outside to collect the mail when I heard the sound of barking and twigs snapping. That was when I remembered Jocko. God, it had been so long since I thought of him. My heart was aching as I went inside and read through my mail. I spoke to myself as I went through all of it. Bill, more bills. Finally, the last envelope revealed itself. The paper was trimmed yellow, clearly signifying how old it was. It had an old red wax stamp that had been burdened with time. It was slightly chipped. I read the date on the envelope, 1978. I was confused. I decided to open it and was amazed to find a letter from my grandpa. Grandpa had died long ago when I was about 17. When I read the letter, each sentence made me feel more like crying than the last. "Hey, Felix. I'm really sorry about Jocko. He was a good boy. I'm sure he'll come back to you someday. He's probably out there chasing squirrels. I hope this letter reaches you and doesn't get stuck in processing or any of that. Sincerely, Grandpa." The last sentence broke the somber mood as I chuckled to myself. The irony of the situation, lightening my day as I started to get ready for work. I checked my phone, 6:34 a.m. I had work in about half an hour, so I went to get some coffee ready while I went to the bedroom. As I walked into my room, I was greeted with a sight that made me feel at home. My bedroom reminded me of my childhood. The ugly old wallpaper, the yellow-stained tiles, the amazing smell of mustiness greeting me like a warm embrace. I was happy here. As I was getting ready, I heard more barking. I recognized it. I couldn't pinpoint how exactly, but something about it was familiar. As I finally walked out of my bedroom, I stopped in my tracks. I realized what it was and recognized the sound. It was Jocko. It was the same high-pitched, mellow bark that I recognized from my childhood. I immediately rushed out my door. I ran to the back of the house. I frantically rounded the corner to see my childhood best friend lying in the dirt. Immediately, two details popped into my head, which made me happy and confused. I had moved around 700 miles away from my childhood home. And two was, when Jocko ran off, he was around 5 years old. Dogs don't live that long, I thought. Maybe this was a different dog that sounded and looked like Jocko. That thought was immediately disproven as I noticed the bright red collar and the brass pendant around his neck. I ran up to him and he didn't even seem fazed. He started to groan as I looked at the pendant. The initials read J.O. My hands were shaking so violently, it looked like I was having a seizure. I immediately embraced my long-lost best friend, but something felt wrong. He was way too cold, even for the early morning weather. I sort of flinched, but I didn't care. I hugged him so tightly, I felt my body ache. Finally, I got up and let him inside. He moved weirdly, almost like he was drunk. I chalked it up to his extreme old age, but I noticed how the collar seemed pristine. I immediately called into work and explained how I wasn't going to make it because I wasn't feeling good. As I stood there on the phone, I noticed how my dog kept on bumping into things. Again, I thought it was old age. I couldn't believe I'd found Jocko after all these years anyway. Sleepless nights I had endured over his disappearance. I couldn't help but tear up as I hugged him again. That's when I noticed. Jocko's eyes had turned a brown color. I very vividly remembered him having sapphire blue eyes. In fact, it was such a prominent feature that we nicknamed him Bluey at the time. I was shocked. I didn't know how to react. My emotions were a mixture of curiosity, confusion, and fear. I sort of just stared at him as I analyzed his face. Everything about it seemed crooked. It was like he had slowly morphed. I noticed patches of dark fur I hadn't seen before. His snout seemed more jagged, but the biggest detail was his teeth. They seemed way too sharp and narrow for a dog. I hadn't even seen that in wolves. I sort of pondered as I went to get him food and water. Everything raced through my mind at once. Thoughts like, "That's not your dog," or "How did he get here?" I was so confused, I felt almost dazed as I brought the dish of foul-smelling dog food and tap water to Jocko. I sat it down and watched as his previously sloppy demeanor changed into a fast, focused strut. He elegantly waltzed over to his meal and proceeded to devour it within seconds. "Must be hungry, huh, Jock?" I said sarcastically. That joking mood changed into something serious as he glanced from his food and stared right at me. He was looking into my eyes as I glanced at him. As odd as it sounds, his eyes seemed human. I can't properly put it into words. I looked at him, but right as I was about to look away, he groaned at me. Now I swear to you guys, I heard the word help come from that groan. It was like a whisper traveling into the room. I immediately felt sick as I backed away. I don't understand why I decided to do what I did next, but some people make mistakes in a moment of quick thought. I decided to keep Jocko with me. I thought, all of this is just stress. None of this is serious. You probably just heard something. I really had no clue what was about to happen, though. Because I didn't have work that afternoon, I decided that finishing up my basement would be a great idea. I'd been working on this thing for 5 months, and it was a perfect man cave. Hardwood floors, a massive TV, felt like a perfect hangout place for someone like me. I even had a vintage Atari sitting there to relive my childhood passions. As I slowly crept down the steps, each creak and groan and crack making me feel nervous. I was still quite shaken up from Jocko's sudden appearance, and I had to think for a good minute about what to do. You obviously can't just take in an enormous husky after years and years of not owning a dog. I started to remember how long it had been since I'd seen him last. 1978? That was simply not possible. It was 2023, and that meant that Jocko would be 50 years old. I started to think, what if this was a completely different dog I just brought in? What if he's completely rabid? I started to worry as I shifted damp cardboard boxes in the basement. Each shift made me flinch as I heard the familiar sound of paws stomping on hardwood. I listened as Jocko slowly walked down the wooden stairs. I turned around to see him. His tongue was hanging out. I saw black viscous liquid on his tongue, and I almost gagged. The room was filled up with a pungent odor. Think of roadkill that's been left to rot in the sun. I started to gag even harder as I watched Jocko take very slow steps towards me. It reminded me of a wolf silently approaching its prey. Then I saw the collar, and all previous thoughts of this being a different dog were wiped away. In awe, I watched as he drove me into a corner. Jocko, calm down, boy. It's me. It's Felix." I watched as he perked his head to the side. His ears twitched. "That's a good boy." Every word I spoke felt like a challenge. It was actually hard to think. I was so worried about him going crazy, I didn't even notice the silence. There were no more birds fluttering or calling. No more insects or bees. Hell, not even the wind was swaying. It felt hopeless. I didn't know why I dismissed the smell or the black liquid that was on my once beloved dog's tongue. I was just worried about being bitten. I stretched my hand after a bout of thought and began to slowly stroke him. Even though he was clearly old and had been outside for decades, his fur still felt the same. It was incredibly smooth. It felt like silk was caressing my hands. I watched as he began to calm down. I finally walked past him and led him up the stairs. I was contemplating calling a vet. After a few minutes of thinking, I decided that it was for the best. Hell, what if Jocko had rabies and he bit me? I shook the thought off and rang up our local vet. After a few minutes of discussing, we decided on an appointment for tomorrow. I sighed. Even a day with Jocko felt like torture. I was actually surprised. After so many years of missing and begging for my dog to come back, I was now contemplating making him go away. Eventually, it fell dark, and the feeling of tiredness swiftly overtook me. I got ready for bed and decided to check up on Jocko before I went to sleep. As I quietly tiptoed down the stairs, each step making me feel more on edge, that was when I heard a very distinct sound. It was like something wet slapping a hard surface. I could hear the echoes. It was coming from the basement. I felt a sense of dread deep in my stomach as I slowly rummaged to find the door to my basement. I noticed something. The door was wide open. I very slowly began to make my way down the stairs. Every hair on my body started to stand up as I made it to the halfway point. It was cold. I felt my body begin to shake violently as the sound got louder and louder. It was reducing my mind to rubble as I finally made it down. What stood in the corner of my basement was something that would haunt me, even as I lost my memories. Jocko stood there silently on his hind legs. He had something in his mouth. The moon illuminated him through the basement window, and it revealed the blood dripping from his teeth. Finally, I realized what it was. It was the collar of my dog. It had been ripped off of him and still had clumps of fur and parts of it on his neck. It had blood staining it. I immediately looked at this thing's neck and came to a horrible realization. That same collar was on its neck. This was not my dog that stood before me. I let out a yelp, and suddenly there was silence. My mind felt frozen as this thing turned around to see me. Its face was so horribly mangled I could see little bits of mange littering its face like spots of paint. Its eyes were black. I could see my own reflection in them, like a mirror. Then I watched as it dropped the collar, and now presumably my dead dog, as it slowly approached me. It walked like a human. I finally found the courage to get away as I ran. As I made it up the stairs and out the door, that thing chased after me. It slammed into my glass sliding door, making it shatter. It let out a horrible yelp. It stood between me and the only place I could now use as an escape. I did the only thing I could think to do. I ran up the stairs and went into my room. I slammed the door shut and locked it as I began to barricade myself with loose furniture. I ran over to my phone and dialed 911, the feeling of hopelessness and sorrow only slightly fading away as the feeling of another person speaking to me came on the line. 911, what's your emergency? Listen, my dog's gone crazy. I'm in my room right now trying to keep it away. It's somewhere in my house. I don't know where. Please just send help. I heard the sound of shuffling on the other end of the line. All right, sir. Make sure to stay on the line and keep out of sight, okay? Everything's going to be okay. What's your address? The sound of horrible screaming and rummaging began to litter the air like a pathogen as I continued. 178 Mangrove Drive. Please send help. I don't know how much longer I can bear this. That's when I looked out the window. I saw the face of my dog looking at me. I lost my breath almost immediately. Its face began to warp into a human. Its skin was white. It smiled at me. How was it this tall? Oh God, my dog's looking at me. It wants to kill me. Please send help. Oh my God. I told these things to the operator as I stared back at the thing. It put its unnaturally slender hand up to its mouth and made a shushing gesture. I screamed, but it didn't last long as I felt the elevating sounds of this thing's horrible chuckle. I felt so alone. It kept on looking at me with its horrible grin, its smile so large as it stretched beyond my window. Then it showed me something that has me crying while I write this. I watched in terror as its hands reached down and pulled something off the ground. It began to pull up a gray fur-covered body. It was Jocko. I could see the red collar on its decapitated body. I began to cry maniacally. Why was this happening? Was this all a dream? Sir, we're 2 minutes away. Hang in there. The voice on the line echoed as a feeling of hope began to fill my body. Something that quickly faded as the thing began to put its hand to my window. I watched as it began to feel around before finally pulling it open. The squeal of the window finally reached the top, and I began to sob. I was ready to accept death. It took the body of my mangled dog and threw it into the room. It landed at my feet, the blood pooling the carpet, making it look like red wine had spilled everywhere. I began to embrace my long-gone friend in my lap as I watched the thing smile at me. I heard it stomp as it began to walk away. I didn't care for my life anymore. I sat there crying and hugging my dead best friend. Jocko, no, I quietly uttered as I held him in my lap. I heard the fading sounds of sirens began to approach as I sat there with my dog. The rest of it's a blur. I woke up in the hospital. I don't know how, but I'd cuts littered all over my body. I thought it was from me hurrying to barricade my door, or the glass from the initial impact of that thing slamming into my sliding door. It's been 2 days now. I'm still in the hospital. I don't know what's happening. My house is being investigated. I might be sent to jail under suspicion of animal abuse and neglect, but I'm not so sure. I love you, Jocko. I wish you'd never ran away. You're still here. I thought you might be. Thanks for joining me for tonight's story. If your insatiable appetite for horror knows no bounds, might I suggest one of our playlists, or one of our previous stories in the archive? There should be one appearing at the end of the story any minute now. And of course, if you're not subscribed, why not go ahead and hit that subscribe button? Maybe hit that notification bell so you don't miss any of the spooky things that we do here. If you prefer your horror a little more analog, you can always pick up one of my books. There's a link below to my latest, and it'll take you to all the great things that I've posted on Amazon. For my book lovers in the audience, I always suggest coming on down to Patreon so you can become part of my ghostly reader tier and get a book anytime I write one, which is usually about twice a year. Speaking of my patrons, let's go ahead and thank them, shall we? Thanks to Unicorn Hollow for being our spooky ghost contributor. Thanks to Janet and Lady Vengeance for being our spooky skeleton tier contributors. Thanks to Hi Stacy, Winter, Xaronan, Emily Coltsfoot, Stephanie Carrington, Marianne Schuler, Tyler Parker, and Jennifer Damron for being our ghostly reader tier contributors. Thanks, everyone. We just couldn't do the show without you. If you think you might like to support the show in a more monetary fashion, come on down to Patreon. I have many tiers. I'm sure you'll find one that suits you best. I always recommend the ghostly reader tier since you get a signed book anytime I write one on your doorstep. But I have many tiers, and again, I'm sure you'll find one to suit you. And as always, thanks for stopping by. Dr. Plague, signing off. Have a wonderful evening.